Isley Quinn had mastered the art of invisibility. By the time the sun rose over Manhattan and the marble corridors of Stratford and Hale filled with designer heels and expensive cologne, she had already cleaned half the executive floor without a sound. She moved through the office like a whisper, polishing glass, emptying trash, and dusting award plaques with fingers that once turned the pages of rare manuscripts in a quiet Viennese library. Now she swept up remnants of high-stakes litigation, crumbs from catered lunches, and lipstick-smudged glasses left behind by women who would never look her in the eye. No one at Stratford and Hale knew her story, and no one cared to ask. To them, she was just another uniform figure with rubber-soled shoes and calloused hands. She wore her silence like armor. Her accent, a soft, hard-to-place blend of Central European vowels and Slavic consonants, marked her as foreign, and in the hurried world of elite law, foreign was synonymous with background noise. Most nights she worked long after her shift technically ended, not because she was paid for overtime, but because she found refuge in the stillness of the office once the last partner had left. In that silence, surrounded by mahogany desks and half-drunk espressos, Isley came alive. She wandered from room to room collecting abandoned documents, contracts in Mandarin, briefs in French, deposition notes filled with legal Latin. She never took them off the premises, never stole a single sheet. She simply read, absorbed, translated in her mind, and then wrote down what she understood in a battered black notebook she kept tucked under her cleaning cart, hidden beneath the rags. Sometimes she whispered passages aloud, just to hear the language move through her again. She missed it, the texture of words, the nuances of idiom, the poetry and legal argument. There had been a time not long ago when she had stood in front of lecture halls teaching comparative linguistics and political semiotics, a time when students quoted her papers and conference organizers begged her to speak. But that life had ended with a single phone call, the kind that doesn't leave room for second chances. She rarely let herself remember her old name, the name on her diplomas, the one etched in gold letters on book covers still gathering dust in European libraries. That woman no longer existed. In America, she was Isley Quinn. She paid her rent in cash, avoided official records, and never told anyone that she spoke 9 languages fluently and could dissect a legal contract like a surgeon with a scalpel. The only person who came close to noticing her was Frank, the night security guard on the 3rd floor. He was old, half-deaf, and usually napping behind the monitors, but he always nodded at her when she walked past. Once he'd caught her reading a contract in Russian and squinting at a paragraph like it offended her. "You a lawyer?" he'd asked, half-joking. "Only in a different life," she'd replied without smiling. Frank didn't ask again. One night, she found herself lingering in the firm's largest conference room. The whiteboard was still covered in scribbles from a deposition strategy meeting, and someone had left a folder marked "Confidential Translation Pending" next to a half-eaten plate of sushi. Isley hesitated. She shouldn't, but her fingers itched. She slid into the nearest leather chair and opened the folder, scanning quickly. It was a contract involving a foreign pharmaceutical company, written mostly in Japanese with side notes in English and an attached draft of a poorly machine-translated summary. She muttered the first few lines aloud, correcting them as she went. The mistakes were obvious to anyone with real linguistic training. The phrasing was wrong, the legal context misunderstood, the tone too casual for what was clearly a high-stakes clause involving liability across borders. She flipped to the last page and began reworking the translation in her notebook, lips moving silently as the night deepened around her. She didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. The glass door swung open sharply, and a tall figure stepped in, casting a long shadow across the floor. He wore a charcoal gray coat over a black suit, and his presence radiated that peculiar type of self-possession that only came with generational power. Isley froze, her hand still holding the pen mid-word. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" the man snapped, his voice low and sharp, like a blade barely unsheathed. She looked up, meeting his eyes, pale, clear, and watching her with something between suspicion and fury. "I was just cleaning," she said evenly, her accent thicker when she was caught off guard. "Cleaning? With a pen?" He strode forward and snatched the folder from the table, flipping through the pages. "This is a restricted document." She stood slowly. "I didn't touch the file. I was only reading." "Reading," he repeated as if the word were a joke. Then his eyes dropped to her notebook. "What's this?" he asked, stepping forward before she could close it. He read a few lines and frowned. This is the original clause. Translated correctly. His voice dipped lower. You did this? Isley said nothing. He laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. If you're so smart, he said, mockery dripping from every word, translate it. For a moment, she just stared at him. She could see the type. Arrogant, too rich to remember what it was to be curious, too powerful to question his place in the world. But she also saw something else behind his scorn. Doubt, a crack, and that more than the insult made her speak. So she translated it, line by line, first in flawless Japanese, then in formal French, then again softly in legal Mandarin, her tone dry and precise. When she finished, there was no laughter, just silence. The man stood there holding the folder as if it had become a burden. His mouth opened, then closed again. He looked at her like she was something he hadn't accounted for. Something dangerous, something rare. What's your name? He finally asked. She hesitated, then said simply, Isley. He studied her for a long time. You work for me now, he said. Then he turned and walked out. And just like that, the woman who had spent years trying not to be seen was no longer invisible. Isley Quinn had mastered the art of invisibility. By the time the sun rose over Manhattan and the marble corridors of Stratford and Hale filled with designer heels and expensive cologne, she had already cleaned half the executive floor without a sound. She moved through the office like a whisper, polishing glass, emptying trash, and dusting award plaques with fingers that once turned the pages of rare manuscripts in a quiet Viennese library. Now she swept up remnants of high-stakes litigation, crumbs from catered lunches, and lipstick-smudged glasses left behind by women who would never look her in the eye. No one at Stratford and Hale knew her story, and no one cared to ask. To them, she was just another uniformed figure with rubber-soled shoes and calloused hands. She wore her silence like armor. Her accent, a soft, hard-to-place blend of Central European vowels and Slavic consonants, marked her as foreign, and in the hurried world of elite law, foreign was synonymous with background noise. Most nights, she worked long after her shift technically ended, not because she was paid for overtime, but because she found refuge in the stillness of the office once the last partner had left. In that silence, surrounded by mahogany desks and half-drunk espressos, Isley came alive. She wandered from room to room collecting abandoned documents, contracts in Mandarin, briefs in French, deposition notes filled with legal Latin. She never took them off the premises, never stole a single sheet. She simply read, absorbed, translated in her mind, and then wrote down what she understood in a battered black notebook she kept tucked under her cleaning cart, hidden beneath the rags. Sometimes she whispered passages aloud, just to hear the language move through her again. She missed it. The texture of words, the nuances of idiom, the poetry and legal argument. There had been a time not long ago when she had stood in front of lecture halls teaching comparative linguistics and political semiotics. A time when students quoted her papers and conference organizers begged her to speak. But that life had ended with a single phone call, the kind that doesn't leave room for second chances. She rarely let herself remember her old name, the name on her diplomas, the one etched in gold letters on book covers still gathering dust in European libraries. That woman no longer existed. In America, she was Isley Quinn. She paid her rent in cash, avoided official records, and never told anyone that she spoke 9 languages fluently and could dissect a legal contract like a surgeon with a scalpel. The only person who came close to noticing her was Frank, the night security guard on the 3rd floor. He was old, half-deaf, and usually napping behind the monitors, but he always nodded at her when she walked past. Once, he'd caught her reading a contract in Russian and squinting at a paragraph like it offended her. "You a lawyer?" he'd asked, half-joking. "Only in a different life," she'd replied without smiling. Frank didn't ask again. One night, she found herself lingering in the firm's largest conference room. The whiteboard was still covered in scribbles from a deposition strategy meeting, and someone had left a folder marked "Confidential, Translation Pending" next to a half-eaten plate of sushi. Isley hesitated. She shouldn't, but her fingers itched. She slid into the nearest leather chair and opened the folder, scanning quickly. It was a contract involving a foreign pharmaceutical company, written mostly in Japanese, with side notes in English and an attached draft of a poorly machine-translated summary. She muttered the first few lines aloud, correcting them as she went. The mistakes were obvious to anyone with real linguistic training. The phrasing was wrong, the legal context misunderstood, the tone too casual for what was clearly a high-stakes clause involving liability across borders. She flipped to the last page and began reworking the translation in her notebook, lips moving silently as the night deepened around her. She didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. The glass door swung open sharply, and a tall figure stepped in, casting a long shadow across the floor. He wore a charcoal gray coat over a black suit, and his presence radiated that peculiar type of self-possession that only came with generational power. Isley froze, her hand still holding the pen mid-word. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" the man snapped, his voice low and sharp, like a blade barely unsheathed. She looked up, meeting his eyes, pale, clear, and watching her with something between suspicion and fury. "I was just cleaning," she said evenly, her accent thicker when she was caught off guard. "Cleaning? With a pen?" He strode forward and snatched the folder from the table, flipping through the pages. "This is a restricted document." She stood slowly. "I didn't touch the file. I was only reading." "Reading," he repeated, as if the word were a joke. Then his eyes dropped to her notebook. "What's this?" he asked, stepping forward before she could close it. He read a few lines and frowned. "This is the original clause, translated correctly." His voice dipped lower. "You did this?" Isley said nothing. He laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "If you're so smart," he said, mockery dripping from every word, "translate it." For a moment, she just stared at him. She could see the type. Arrogant, too rich to remember what it was to be curious, too powerful to question his place in the world. But she also saw something else behind his scorn. Doubt. A crack. And that, more than the insult, made her speak. So she translated it. Line by line. First in flawless Japanese, then in formal French, then again softly, in legal Mandarin, her tone dry and precise. When she finished, there was no laughter, just silence. The man stood there, holding the folder as if it had become a burden. His mouth opened, then closed again. He looked at her like she was something he hadn't accounted for, something dangerous, something rare. "What's your name, Midoraiduram?" "Shorty Raran." "Sorry," he finally asked. She hesitated, then said simply, "Isley." He studied her for a long time. "You work for me now," he said. Then he turned and walked out. And just like that, the woman who had spent years trying not to be seen was no longer invisible. The next morning felt strange from the moment Isley woke. She had hardly slept, haunted by the events of the night before. The man's voice echoed in her mind, sharp, clipped, and full of authority. "You work for me now." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a command. But he hadn't told her who he was, and she hadn't dared ask. Something about the way he spoke had made her hesitate, not out of fear exactly, but out of the distinct sensation that he was someone who could upend her life with a flick of his hand. She arrived at the building an hour earlier than usual, wearing the same uniform she always wore. Gray pants, black sneakers, and a slightly oversized jacket with the faded logo of the cleaning services agency stitched above the left pocket. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight bun. She looked ordinary. She was not. The security guard at the front desk looked up as she swiped her outdated ID badge. "Ms. Quinn," he said, eyebrows lifting. "You've got a note here." He handed her a cream-colored envelope with her name written in bold, careful print. Isley Quinn. No title, no job description, no signature. Just her name. She stared at it for a second before opening it. Inside was a single line. Office 56A. Noon. Don't be late. She read it twice, heart suddenly pounding in her chest. She had never been to the 56th floor. That was where the elite worked. Equity partners, high-value clients, and the executive team. People like her never set foot up there unless it was to clean after hours. She tucked the note into her jacket and went straight to her cart, trying to keep her mind occupied by wiping surfaces, replacing soap dispensers, and emptying bins. But nothing could slow the nerves growing in her stomach. At 11:47 a.m., she ducked into the nearest restroom to wash her hands and smooth her clothes. It was the first time in years that she actually cared how she looked at work. She hated herself for it a little. She looked in the mirror and reminded herself that this wasn't a dream. She had been seen, she had been challenged, and she had answered. Whatever this meeting was, she wasn't going to face it like a coward. When the elevator doors opened on the 56th floor, it was like stepping into another world. The air smelled faintly of bergamot and leather. The walls were covered in dark paneling and abstract art. Plush carpets silenced her footsteps. No one stopped her. No one even looked at her. Everyone here moved like they belonged, like the world bent around them. She didn't. Yet here she was. Office 5608 was at the end of a long hallway with a frosted glass door. She knocked once. A voice inside said, "Come in." She stepped inside and stopped. The man from last night was sitting at a sleek desk made of black marble, his suit impeccably pressed, a tablet in one hand and a glass of water untouched beside him. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "You're early," he said. "I wasn't sure if late would be acceptable," Isley replied, keeping her voice neutral. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." She did, keeping her back straight, hands folded in her lap. He didn't speak right away. He studied her. Not the way men usually did, appraising or predatory, but with a kind of cold calculation, like she was a piece of a puzzle he couldn't quite fit yet. Then he said, "I'm Soren Aldridge, senior partner. My name is on the door downstairs." She blinked. The Aldridge in Stratford and Hale. That Aldridge. He was more than just a partner. He was part of the bloodline that founded the firm. Her stomach twisted slightly, but she didn't show it. "You said I work for you now," she said. "What does that mean?" Soren leaned back in his chair and finally smiled, just barely. "It means I want to offer you a position, not as a cleaner, as a consultant." She stared at him. "I don't have papers," she said bluntly. "No references, no degrees I can prove, nothing that makes me legitimate. Except for the fact that you translated a multi-jurisdictional pharmaceutical contract in 3 languages, under pressure, with perfect fluency," he said. "That makes you more legitimate than half the people on my payroll." She didn't reply. She didn't trust his sudden generosity. No one offered jobs like this to people like her. He continued, "You'll be paid under a discretionary clause as a language and cultural advisor. I'll keep you off the official records. We'll call it private consultancy. You'll report only to me. No one else needs to know who you are. And what do you expect in return?" "Loyalty," he said, "and that you do for me what you did last night. Understand what no one else can." She frowned. "Why me?" He looked at her, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something softer in his voice. "Because you're not trying to be seen. You just see, and that's rare." The silence stretched between them for a moment. "I don't trust you," she said. "You shouldn't," he replied without hesitation. "But I'm giving you a chance no one else will." She thought about it, about the risks, about the strange thrill of being invited into the heart of a machine that had ignored her for years, about the part of her that missed being needed for her mind, not her silence. Finally, she said, "I'll do it, but I want full control over when I leave." He nodded. "Done. And if anyone tries to dig into me, if anyone even says my name—" "They won't," he said. "I'll make sure of it." She stood and extended her hand. He shook it firmly, and in that moment, Isley knew she had just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. This wasn't just a job. This was an invitation into a world where truth was currency and language was power. She had been invisible for a long time. Not anymore. Isley's first official day as Soren Aldridge's private consultant began not with a formal orientation or introductions, but with a blank, soundless ride in the executive elevator to a floor she had never seen, the 49th. Technically closed off to most of the staff, it was used for sensitive client matters. A vague term she had heard whispered between paralegals, usually followed by lowered voices or silent stares. Now, with a digital keycard Soren had handed her himself that morning, she stepped out into a narrow steel-toned corridor, lit by soft recessed lighting and lined with locked doors, each marked only by a number. No names, no plaques, no reception desk. Her new office, or if it could be called that, was tucked in the back. A windowless room with a heavy wooden desk, a laptop, a locked cabinet, and 3 shelves filled with thick binders in multiple languages. It wasn't luxurious, but it wasn't meant to be. It was designed for work, for silence, and for secrecy. The message was clear. What happened here was meant to stay buried. There was a note waiting for her on the desk. Handwritten, not typed. Neat block lettering. 3 files on the desk. Choose one. Translate fully. Add notes. Deliver before 2 p.m. Essay. She looked at the files. One was in Turkish, one in Swahili, and one in classical Latin. An obscure, archaic property clause embedded in an estate dispute. She smiled faintly. The Latin it was. Time melted as she worked, the words unfolding in her head like an old poem she hadn't recited in years. She translated line by line, pausing only to add margin notes in English and cross-reference certain terms with a 17th century legal dictionary that she found in the corner of the cabinet. It was rigorous, demanding, and precise. The exact kind of intellectual challenge she used to thrive on before everything in her life had turned to ash. By the time she was done, her hands were cramped but steady. At 1:47 p.m., she placed the translated document inside a leather folder, walked it up to the 56th floor, and entered Soren's office without knocking. He was on the phone pacing, his jaw clenched in the way she'd come to recognize as his "I'm about to eviscerate someone" mode. He raised a finger to pause her, kept speaking for another 2 minutes in rapid-fire Portuguese, then finally set the phone down and looked at her. "You're early." She handed him the folder. "You said before 2. He opened it and began reading. His expression didn't change, but his eyes slowed as he scanned the lines. Then he read it again, this time more carefully, and finally set the folder down. "Where did you find the correction to clause 41? He asked. There was a discrepancy in the wording, usufructus instead of usus. Whoever translated it last didn't catch it. It changes the entire context of the inheritance clause. One gives temporary rights, the other gives direct possession." He leaned back in his chair, just staring at her. "I taught Roman legal frameworks at the University of Salzburg," she added, her voice matter-of-fact. "Of course you did," he said quietly. He didn't ask her to leave. He simply gestured toward the chair across from him, and to her surprise, she sat. The office was still the same, sleek, cold, and curated, but something between them had begun to shift. He no longer looked at her like an anomaly. He looked at her like a weapon he was just beginning to understand. "I didn't bring you here out of charity," he said after a moment. "I need leverage. Strategic leverage. This firm is a glass fortress, Isley, and the cracks are everywhere. The partners smile to your face while gutting you in closed rooms. The clients have deeper secrets than we're allowed to name. My mother runs this place like a chessboard, and every piece exists to serve the king, or queen in her case, and I'm tired of being her knight." Isley folded her hands in her lap. "So you brought me in as what? A rogue piece? Something unpredictable?" "I brought you in because you see things others don't. Because I need someone beside me who doesn't care about titles or power, but understands the subtext beneath every contract, every word." "And what do I get out of this?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He rose, walked over to the wall behind his desk, and pulled down a panel she hadn't noticed before. Inside was a map, hand-drawn, annotated in 6 languages, littered with red strings connecting client names to corporate holdings across countries. It wasn't just a map. It was a conspiracy, the kind only someone inside the system could build or destroy. "You get to pick which walls come down," he said, "and which ones stay standing." She stared at the map for a long time. Names jumped out at her. Places, dates. Some of them she had seen before. In the papers, in court transcripts she'd cleaned off the floor. She thought of all the years she had worked in silence while men like this shaped the world around her, never knowing she could read every language they used to hide their crimes. And she understood, in that moment, why Soren had brought her in. "You're building something," she said softly. He turned to her. "No," he said. "I'm unbuilding it." They didn't speak again for several minutes. He returned to his desk, and she quietly stood, turned, and walked back out the way she came. That night, in her small apartment above the laundromat, she opened her notebook and wrote 5 words across the top of a blank page. "He doesn't want a translator." She paused, then added, "He wants a witness." And for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid to become one. Isley noticed the change almost immediately. The firm, once a cold and distant organism in which she had merely survived, now breathed differently around her. Doors that once stayed shut were now open to her. Conversations paused when she walked into a room, not because of disdain, but because people didn't know how to place her. She wasn't dressed like them. She wasn't listed in any internal directory. She didn't even wear a badge. Yet she walked with a quiet confidence and always left with more than she had come for. Files, names, details, fragments of secrets. Soren hadn't explained exactly what he expected of her, beyond translating and interpreting sensitive materials, but it quickly became clear that he relied on her in a way that unsettled those around him. She wasn't simply decoding languages. She was noticing patterns, uncovering cultural loopholes in international agreements, calling out subtle manipulations buried in legal jargon that the firm had either missed or ignored for years. In meetings, Soren often let her speak instead of him. He'd glance her way mid-negotiation, and she'd offer a single phrase in a soft tone, and the entire room would recalibrate. They worked late most nights, not because it was necessary, but because both of them seemed to operate best when the office emptied, when the fluorescent hum dulled and the world outside fell asleep. They'd order food, Greek, Ethiopian, Vietnamese, and eat in the war room surrounded by maps and files and silence. Occasionally, they spoke about non-legal things. She told him about a ruined cathedral in Prague that she used to sit in alone for hours, just to listen to the echo of her own thoughts. He told her about a jazz bar in New Orleans where he once lost 4 hours to a saxophonist who never looked up once from his instrument. There was a gentleness in these conversations and a sharpness too. Neither of them gave themselves away easily, and that tension became the invisible string between them. One night, he asked her where she had learned to speak Farsi with such fluency. She hesitated, then said simply, Iran. Before, he didn't press her for more. Another night, she asked why he hadn't left the firm if he hated it so much. He replied, because my mother built it, and I want to see what happens when someone takes it apart brick by brick. Isley understood that, more than she wanted to admit. The intimacy between them didn't build through grand gestures or flirtation. It built in glances exchanged across boardrooms, in the way Soren reached for her notes before his own during meetings, in how she could walk into his office without knocking and find him waiting for her. Laptop open, fingers tapping idly like he only started thinking when she arrived. But it was during the Kane Bedrosian arbitration hearing that everything truly began to shift. The case involved a series of contracts between a Turkish infrastructure firm and a corrupt municipal partner in Georgia, the country, not the state. Isley had been poring over the files for days, translating the original drafts and identifying several lines that had been strategically altered in the English versions to mask illegal subcontracting deals. She had flagged the discrepancies and brought them to Soren, who stared at her findings with something like disbelief. This changes everything, he muttered, pacing behind his desk. This means they breached Clause 18 6 months before the supposed default. Which means they lied, she added, and you can prove it. Soren stood silent for a moment, then said, You're coming with me. To the hearing? Yes. She hesitated. I'm not a lawyer. You're better. At the arbitration held in a private neutral forum at a high-rise overlooking Central Park, Isley sat beside Soren at the table reserved for lead counsel. She wore a simple navy dress with long sleeves, her hair down for the first time in weeks. She felt the eyes on her, lawyers, judges, clients, scanning her like she didn't belong. But she sat still, hands folded, eyes clear. She knew the documents better than anyone in the room. When the opposing counsel brought up the translated version of the contract to defend their client's breach, Soren stood and said calmly, We'd like to submit an analysis by Ms. Quinn, linguistic and legal discrepancies between the certified Turkish contract and its manipulated English counterpart. The arbitrator blinked. Ms. Quinn is your translator? She's an expert in comparative legal linguistics, Soren replied, his voice hardening slightly. She'll demonstrate how the translation altered the meaning of liability clauses in ways that intentionally obscured responsibility. Isley stood. She didn't look at the opposing counsel. She looked at the contract in her hand and began to explain, first in English, and then Turkish. Then she walked them through line-by-line structural mismatches, verbs that had been softened, conditions removed, entire subclauses reworded to shift burden. Her tone was calm, clinical, but her precision left the room stunned. By the time she sat down again, No one was asking who she was. Later, as they left the hearing and stepped into the elevator, Soren turned to her and said, "You made them afraid." She looked at him, surprised. "Not because of what you said," he added, "because you were right. And because you were quiet about it." They didn't speak for a while. The elevator descended floor by floor, the silence between them thick with something neither of them could name. Back at the office, she gathered her things to leave, thinking the day was over. But just as she reached the elevator, Soren appeared behind her. "Dinner," he said. She turned. "You're asking me to dinner?" "I'm asking if you're hungry," he replied, "because I'm starving and I don't want to eat alone." She hesitated for only a second. "Okay." They walked out into the city together, not as lawyer and assistant, not as superior and subordinate, but as two people beginning to rewrite the rules of their world, one layer at a time. It began quietly, like all things that become dangerous do. A whisper in the break room, a pause in conversation when Isley entered a hallway, a misplaced folder left on her desk that didn't belong to any of her current assignments, filled with redacted pages and annotations she hadn't made. At first, she thought she was imagining it, perhaps reading too much into office noise, the lingering paranoia of someone who had spent too many years in hiding. But as the week wore on, the feeling solidified. People were watching her. It wasn't overt. No one asked her anything directly, but the looks were longer now, speculative rather than dismissive. A few junior associates, ones who had never spoken a word to her before, suddenly began offering half-hearted greetings. One even asked her where she'd studied, as if fishing for a way to trap her into revealing more than she wanted to. Isley didn't answer. She knew the signs. She had seen what exposure looked like before, in another country, in another life, when her colleagues had turned on her the moment she became inconvenient. At first, she didn't tell Soren. She wanted to handle it herself, to believe it would pass. But things escalated quickly. An internal report was circulated accusing an unauthorized translator of accessing client materials without clearance. The report didn't name her, but the implications were obvious. 2 days later, her ID badge suddenly stopped working. The system claimed access error, though no explanation followed. She had to wait for a temp badge at reception, while security watched her with growing interest. That night, she sat in the corner of her apartment, the lights dimmed, her notebook open in her lap, staring at a single sentence she'd written and rewritten 3 times. "I was never meant to stay this long." The following morning, she entered the building through the back entrance, avoiding the lobby altogether. She went directly to the private elevator and used the manual key card Soren had given her in the early days, one that bypassed digital logs. When she reached his office, she found him standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, arms crossed, face unreadable. "You knew this was coming, didn't you?" she asked quietly. He didn't turn around. "The moment you corrected that arbitrator in front of half the board's old allies," he said, "I knew someone would come after you." "Then why didn't you stop it?" Soren finally turned, eyes tired but fierce. "Because I thought I could protect you once it started. I didn't think they'd be this fast." "They're not just fast," she replied. "They're coordinated. This isn't just a leak, it's a campaign." He nodded. "They're scared. And scared people lash out." She walked to his desk and dropped a folder. "This was on my chair this morning. Someone wants me to take the fall for the Galvin-Torres breach. They backdated the files. It looks like I inserted language into the contract to benefit the opposition." Soren picked up the folder, flipping through it slowly. His mouth tightened. "This is Letitia," he said after a moment. "This has her fingerprints all over it." Isley said nothing. She had met Letitia Hale only once, in a corridor during a late night at the firm. The woman hadn't spoken a word to her, but had paused long enough to look at Isley as if she were a weed growing through marble. Now she understood that look better. "You need to go public," she said. "Expose what they're doing." Soren laughed, low and bitter. "They'll spin it. Say I'm trying to protect a mistress, or covering for an internal mole. They'll erase you from the system, and they'll make me look like a deluded prince falling for the help." "Isn't that what's happening?" she asked, meeting his eyes. He looked at her then, deeply, as if seeing through every wall she had left. "It's not a story, Isley," he said. "You're not a fable I tell myself to feel better about what I've done. You're the only person I trust in a building full of knives." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She thought about everything she'd built in the shadows, the systems, the translations, the small victories that had never had her name on them, And now all of it could vanish, reduced to a headline. I can disappear, she said softly. I've done it before. Soren stepped closer. Not again. I won't let you. They'll ruin you, she said. Then let them try. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. She wanted to believe him, but she knew men like him didn't survive political implosions. Not when the attack came from inside their own blood. Letitia wasn't just powerful. She was revered, untouchable, and utterly ruthless. That evening, Isley made her decision. She left the office quietly, took only what she could carry in her satchel, and disabled her phone. She wrote a letter. She didn't say goodbye. She said what needed to be said, the way she always had, precise, honest, and layered with meaning only someone like Soren would read between the lines. I cannot be your weakness. You've spent too long learning how not to need anyone. But I won't be your secret either. I gave you the truth. That was mine to give. Now you must decide what to do with yours. She signed it EQ. Then she vanished. No record. No forwarding address. Just silence. It wasn't cowardice. It was clarity. Because she knew the storm hadn't peaked yet, and if she stayed, it would destroy them both. Soren Aldridge was not used to silence. His world thrived on motion. Emails arriving by the hundreds. Phones vibrating every 7 minutes. Voices echoing in corridors. Decisions made in urgent whispers and sharp commands. The noise was constant, like a heartbeat he didn't have to think about. And for years he had mistaken that noise for life. But after Isley Quinn disappeared, the silence that followed wasn't just noticeable, it was oppressive. It pressed down on his chest every morning when he woke, lingered in the corners of his penthouse apartment, and hung between each tick of the clock in his office. In the hours after she left, Soren read her note a dozen times. He sat alone in his office well past midnight, his glass of whiskey untouched, the letter folded and unfolded in his hand, as if doing so might change the words on the page. He could hear her voice in each sentence. Measured, calm, impossibly direct. She had always known how to say everything without saying too much. She was right, of course. Staying would have made her a target. Leaving had been her way of protecting them both. But what Isley hadn't understood was that Soren had nothing left to protect. Not anymore. In the weeks that followed, the firm turned cold toward him. Board meetings were held without his knowledge. Cases he was leading were reassigned without explanation. His name began to vanish from internal projects, and emails stopped including him in threads that should have required his signature. Letitia Hale didn't speak to him, but her presence was everywhere, like a storm cloud casting shadows even in well-lit rooms. And he knew. He knew she was tightening the noose, not because he had committed some unforgivable betrayal, but because he had brought someone like Isley into their world. A woman with no title, no pedigree, no protection, only brilliance. That alone had made her dangerous. One morning, Soren walked into his office and found a folder waiting for him. No note, no signature, just his name on the front. He opened it and found a full internal inquiry into his unauthorized consultant, complete with surveillance stills of Isley entering and exiting the building after hours, copies of documents she had handled, and a damning accusation that he had failed to disclose her involvement in multiple sensitive cases. At the end of the report was a recommendation, indefinite suspension pending board review. He didn't wait for the board to act. He wrote a letter of resignation and left it on Letitia Hale's desk without a word. When he passed her office, she was seated at her desk, perfectly still, reading a legal brief as if nothing had happened. He didn't look back. For the first time in his life, Soren Aldridge walked away from something before it consumed him. But he didn't disappear. He couldn't. Instead, he took the map from behind his office wall, the one Isley had seen, the one covered in red string and multilingual notes, and moved it into a cramped, one-room space in the East Village, where he registered a new consultancy under a different name. Ardent and Quinn, he called it. He used Isley's name not to own it, but to honor it. She didn't know, of course. She wouldn't. He had no way of contacting her, but he kept the name on the door all the same, like a promise. Clients didn't come quickly. At first, the consultancy was more theory than reality. He had no staff, no secretary, just a battered leather chair, a pot of black coffee, and a stack of files from whistleblowers and small international clients who couldn't afford the likes of Stratford and Hale. But over time, people started to find him. He took only the cases no one else wanted. corruption in private equity firms in Eastern Europe, labor exploitation in North African shipping companies, a falsified environmental impact report involving a French energy consortium. And with each case, he asked himself, what would Isley see here? He thought of how she had read every document like it was alive, how she had looked for what was missing, not just what was written. Her voice lived in the back of his mind, not haunting, but guiding. Nearly 2 months passed. Then one morning, an old contact of his, an international mediator, forwarded him a press release from the UN's linguistic division. It was about a field interpreter deployed to Jordan who had received special commendation for her work in diffusing a cross-border trade dispute involving 3 different dialects and a week of uninterrupted negotiation. The interpreter's name wasn't listed, only a code name, EQ. He didn't hesitate. That same day, Soren booked a flight to Amman, Jordan. He packed only what he needed, 2 changes of clothes, a notebook, and the file. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. Not his clients, not his former colleagues, not even the few friends he had left in New York. He was moving on instinct now. The same instinct that had once made him recognize something rare the night he'd challenged a woman in a janitor's uniform to translate a contract, thinking she'd flinch, and instead watching her rewrite the entire room. When he arrived in Jordan, it was past midnight. The air was dry and warm, laced with the scent of sand and diesel. The city was quieter than he'd expected. Dim golden lights humming softly above narrow streets and sleepy shops. He asked around, followed whispers, offered bribes, waited at the UN compound for nearly 2 days under the pretense of being a visiting legal advisor. No one could tell him exactly who EQ was. But finally, on the 3rd afternoon, a field officer let something slip about a translator working with Bedouin tribes near a disputed border. He chartered a car and drove for hours across open stretches of land that looked like something out of a myth. Rolling hills the color of rust, vast skies, villages carved from stone and silence. At dusk, the car stopped near a small camp made of canvas tents and sun-faded tarps. Children played near a fire. Men in robes sat in circles drinking tea and speaking in a language Soren barely recognized. He stepped out, unsure of what to say. And then he saw her. She was standing near one of the outer tents, speaking gently to a group of elders. Her hair was tied back, a scarf draped over her shoulders. She was thinner, more sun-weathered, dressed in a way that made her look like she belonged here far more than she had ever belonged in a skyscraper. But he'd know her anywhere. He walked toward her slowly, afraid she might vanish again if he moved too quickly. She turned before he could speak. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither said a word. Then she whispered, half in disbelief, "Soren?" He nodded. His voice cracked when he said, "I had to find you." She didn't cry. Neither did he. But the weight between them, the truth, the exile, the unspoken ache of all that had passed, hung like the final word of a long-forgotten sentence finally being spoken again. And in that quiet corner of the desert, with no firm, no lawsuits, no mother watching from the shadows, they were just 2 people who had refused to stay silent and had somehow impossibly found their way back. The desert wind that swept through the camp that night carried the scent of dust and firewood, soft and dry, whispering through canvas and stone like a language of its own. Isley and Soren sat in silence for a long time on the edge of the low ridge, their backs to the camp and their eyes on the stars. Above them, the sky stretched out like black silk scattered with fragments of shattered light. It was the kind of silence neither of them had known in New York, the kind that didn't demand to be filled, but invited space to feel what had long gone unspoken. She hadn't asked him why he came. She hadn't needed to. The truth was in his face, in the lines that had deepened under his eyes, in the weariness of his posture, in the absence of the polished arrogance he once wore like armor. He didn't look like a man trying to win. He looked like a man who had finally understood the cost of everything he'd once thought was worth chasing. She'd changed too. Gone was the woman who had walked through marble halls pretending to be smaller than she was. Her presence now was steady, grounded. There was a strength in her movements, a quiet certainty in her voice when she spoke to the locals, to the aid workers, to the regional officials who consulted her like she was the only one who could hold their fragile piece together. Soren saw it immediately. She didn't just belong here, she was needed. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was low but steady. You left it all behind? I didn't have anything left to stay for, he replied. Not after you were gone. She turned her head slightly, studying him. You could have fought back, taken the board down, exposed Letitia. I did more damage by walking away, he said. They needed me to be complicit. Leaving meant cutting the narrative. The media tried to turn it into a scandal, but without me to play along, the story went quiet. And the firm, it's bleeding now. Internally, slowly. Isley looked back at the stars. What did you do after? I started my own consultancy. Small, under the radar. Pro bono for people no one wants to help. Whistleblowers, displaced contractors, foreign laborers cheated by corporate loopholes. I named it Arden and Quinn. Her head snapped toward him. You used my name? I didn't use it, he said quietly. I honored it. Her breath caught, but she said nothing. Instead, she pulled her scarf tighter and let the silence settle again. It was almost too much. How easily they could fall back into the current that had once connected them. But there was still a part of her that hadn't healed, that remembered what it felt like to be erased, to be left alone in the wake of a war she hadn't started. I didn't want to leave, she said finally. I wanted to stay and fight, but I was terrified you'd let me. I know, he whispered. That was my mistake. She closed her eyes for a moment. Why now? He hesitated then. Because I heard your name again, not from a leak, not from a boardroom, from a man in Tel Aviv who said, there's a woman out in the desert holding peace together with nothing but her voice in a notebook. And I knew. Isley laughed, soft and incredulous. You followed a rumor. I followed a language, and he said, smiling faintly, and it led me here. Their hands brushed between them, not touching yet, not quite brave enough. The space was filled with possibility, but neither rushed it. Too much had passed. Too much had been broken and reassembled. In the days that followed, Soren stayed. Not as an outsider or an intruder, but as a quiet presence in the background. He helped where he could, reviewed translated documents for UN teams, advised on impromptu legal questions, and listened. Mostly he listened. To Isley, to the children in the camp, to the elders who remembered a different kind of world. The desert slowed him down. It rewired his instincts. There were no skyscrapers here, no false urgency. Every conversation mattered, or it didn't happen at all. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast the entire valley in amber, Isley brought him a worn folder. Inside were photocopies of documents, legal testimony, missing persons reports, letters with blurred stamps. This is her, she said, voice tight. My daughter. Soren looked up sharply. Isley's hands trembled only slightly, but her face was unreadable. Her name was Ava. I lost her in Vienna 6 years ago. She was taken by her father during a custody dispute that spiraled into something darker. The courts ignored me. The embassy stalled. By the time I found the right people, they had both vanished. I was advised to disappear. So I did. Soren turned the papers over gently. You never stopped searching? I couldn't, she said, but I stopped hoping. He closed the folder and covered her hand with his. Then let me help. She didn't pull away. He left Jordan 2 days later, but not before they stood again beneath the stars, where she finally leaned her head against his shoulder, her fingers woven with his. When you find her, she said softly, don't promise me justice. Just promise me truth. I can't promise you anything less than that, he said. When the plane took off, he carried her folder in his bag, her voice in his memory and something else tucked beneath his ribs. A purpose that no title, no partnership, no firm had ever given him. The silence no longer haunted him. Now it guided him. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to fix a broken system. He was trying to rebuild a life, hers. And maybe if she let him, their own. It took Soren 5 weeks, 3 countries, and the unraveling of a custody trail that had been buried beneath layers of private security, falsified records, and offshore legal protections to find the truth. He traveled through bureaucracies that moved slower than glaciers, chased the faint outlines of names used in border crossings, and sat with lawyers in hotel lobbies until late at night, trying to piece together what happened to a little girl named Ava, who had been stolen from a courtroom and swallowed by a system designed to protect those with the most money. Each day chipped away at his patience, but not at his resolve. He carried Isley's file in his suitcase like a living thing, worn at the corners, annotated with his own notes in the margins. He refused to let it become just another unsolved tragedy. He finally tracked down the trail in Malta, where a private education account under a fake identity had been used to pay for schooling at an elite international academy. The records were scrubbed, but not enough. The name was different, Aurelia Quinn, but the birth date matched, and the signature on the application form, though forged, bore familiar hesitation in the loops. She had been enrolled for the past year. Isley's daughter was alive. Soren didn't call Isley right away. He didn't want to give her a whisper of hope until he was sure. He waited, confirmed the connection, spoke with school administrators under the guise of an international legal consultant, and arranged a private meeting with the headmistress, who, upon hearing the truth, went pale and quickly excused herself to speak with the board. By the time he walked out of that campus, he had all the confirmation he needed. Ava had been kept under a false name, a false nationality, and in the legal custody of a man who had long since disappeared from the public record. But she was safe, enrolled, and, most importantly, traceable. He boarded the flight back to Jordan with shaking hands. When he arrived at the camp, the sun was rising. He hadn't called ahead. He didn't need to. Isley sensed him the moment he stepped into the open courtyard. She turned, scarf pulled tight around her head, and the moment her eyes met his, she knew. He didn't speak. He just nodded. She walked to him slowly, as if afraid the space between them might collapse if she moved too quickly. Is she? She's in Malta, he said softly. Aurelia Quinn, enrolled under an alias. She's 16 now. Isley's breath caught audibly, her body stiffening. Then, without a sound, she crumpled forward. Soren caught her before her knees hit the ground. He held her as the sobs came, not loud or violent, but trembling and deep, pulled from a place too long buried. He didn't speak. He didn't try to soothe her. He simply let her break. When she could finally speak again, her voice was hoarse. Does she know who I am? Not yet, he said. But she will. We'll do it right. Carefully, legally. You'll have to go through the courts, but now we have leverage. Documents. Proof. And I'll be with you through all of it. She looked up at him then, and in her expression was something Soren hadn't seen in anyone since he left his former life behind. Trust without condition. The process took months. Isley left Jordan soon after, quietly, slipping away from the camp as she had once slipped from New York. No announcements, no farewells. Just the whisper of wind and the soft closing of a tent flap. With Soren by her side, she traveled to Malta, filed the necessary claims, began the process of petitioning for recognition of custody rights under international law. It was complex, drawn out, and emotionally brutal. They faced resistance at every step. Judges skeptical of her story, legal teams backed by whatever fragments of wealth Ava's father had left behind, psychological evaluations and translation hearings designed to delay justice. But they were relentless. Soren built the case with the precision of a man whose own heart was on trial. Isley stood before tribunals and told her story with unwavering grace, never once portraying herself as a victim, only as a mother determined to be reunited with her child. And slowly, the walls began to crumble. The final hearing was held in a small, sterile chamber with rows of empty chairs and a bench of 3 international judges. Isley stood alone when she read her final statement. No legal jargon, no appeal to sympathy. Just a quiet, devastating account of what it meant to lose a child and never give up looking. That night, the ruling came in their favor. Custody restored, identity recognized. And a single line at the bottom of the document that read, "The child is to be reunited with her mother at a location of the court's choosing, pending supervised reintroduction." They met at a neutral facility, white walls, soft lighting, and a translator who barely spoke during the session. Ava was brought in wearing a school uniform, eyes wide, posture wary. She looked older than Isley remembered. Taller, her face unfamiliar and yet so unmistakably her. Isley didn't move forward. She waited. Let Ava come to her. The girl hesitated only for a moment before taking a single step. Then another. Then she ran. The sound of her whispering, "Mama," broke the room open. Soren stood in the back, watching through the glass, his heart rising in his throat. Later, as the 3 of them sat together on a bench in the garden outside, Isley turned to him. "You gave me something I thought I'd never have again." "You gave it to yourself," he replied. I just helped you open the door. Ava looked between them, confused but smiling, her hand in her mother's. Who is he? She asked softly. Isley looked at Soren. Then she said, without hesitation, he's the man who taught me how to fight again, and the man I'm going to marry. Soren exhaled slowly. If she says yes, he added. She smiled. Yes. The following spring, in a quiet ceremony held under olive trees on the coast with no headlines and no boardrooms and no lies, Isley Quinn married Soren Aldrich. Ava stood beside her, holding the vows in all three languages, English, German, and the ancient Latin that once united empires. There were no crowns, no skyscrapers, just truth, and a promise spoken aloud at last, never silent again.